Warm leaves. Every secret tells a story.
It began with a scream that didn't sound human. In the stillness of a late October evening, the sound tore through the grand corridors of Graythorne Hall, an echo that seemed to twist and ripple against the marble walls before vanishing into the cold. The hall itself was a place of unnerving beauty, Victorian stonework, towering windows, and a vast collection of antique mirrors in every hallway, parlour, and staircase landing. No one quite knew why Sir Alister Graythorne had such an obsession with them, but every reflective surface gleamed as though freshly polished, catching and distorting the light of the chandeliers in strange, almost mocking ways. Miss Jane Marple was not meant to be there at all. She had been invited for a weekend gathering by an old acquaintance, Lady Margaret Eversfield, who assured her it would be a restful escape in the countryside. Now she found herself standing just outside the drawing room, teacup in hand, listening to the sound of hurried footsteps pounding on the upper floor. The guests, a mix of family, friends, and business associates, gathered at the foot of the grand staircase, craning their necks upward as one of the servants, ashen-faced, hurried down. "It's Sir Alister," she gasped. He's dead. They found him in the West Wing's blue chamber, sprawled across the rug, his head twisted at an unnatural angle. The room was locked from the inside. The single key was still in the door on the inside. No sign of forced entry. The only window was latched tight from within. There were no footprints except Sir Alister's and the butler's, the latter having broken in through the door after no response to repeated knocking. The doctor, summoned from the village, declared it a broken neck, instant death. But there was no sign of a struggle, no bruising on the arms, no overturned furniture. It looked as though Sir Alister had simply fallen wrong. And yet there was nothing to fall from. Miss Marple stood quietly in the corner, her sharp blue eyes scanning the scene. On the far wall, opposite the bed, hung one of Sir Alister's mirrors, a tall, ornate piece framed in gilded bronze. Oddly, it was smudged in the centre, a faint smear like the trace of fingertips. Lady Margaret hovered beside her. "They say he must have tripped over the rug and, well, you can see how it ended." Miss Marple's eyes never left the mirror. "Yes," she said softly. "Except one does not usually trip forward and end up lying several feet to the side, unless one's attention was caught by something." The investigation began with the police inspector from the nearby town, a brisk man named Inspector Hollis. He disliked the case from the start. Too many witnesses, too little evidence, and a locked room element that made him uncomfortable. "Some trick with the latch, perhaps," he muttered. "Or he locked it himself before dying. But why?" Miss Marple asked gently. "One doesn't go to the trouble of locking oneself in before suffering an accident." She learned that Sir Alister had been in good spirits earlier in the evening, though a little tense. Several guests mentioned he had been distracted during dinner, glancing frequently toward the hallway mirror outside the dining room. After dessert, he excused himself, saying only that he needed to check something upstairs. That was the last time anyone saw him alive. The oddest clue, if it could even be called that, came from the young housemaid. Elsie? She claimed she had been dusting in the West Wing earlier that day and had passed the blue chamber. The door had been ajar, and she thought she saw Sir Alister staring into the mirror. Leaning so close it was as though he were whispering to it. When she asked if he needed anything, he had startled and snapped the door shut without answering. Now the mirror in question seemed more and more curious. Miss Marple examined it closely. It reflected the room perfectly, but when she shifted her position, standing slightly to the left, she noticed something strange. The reflection did not quite align with reality. The far corner of the room appeared subtly wrong, as though the mirror showed it at a slightly different angle than her own eyes did. She said nothing yet, but the thought lodged itself firmly in her mind. Downstairs, tension mounted. Several guests had business dealings with Sir Alister, any of which could have soured. His nephew Henry, who stood to inherit Graythorne Hall, had been seen arguing with him earlier in the day. A foreign art dealer, Monsieur Leclerc, had arrived uninvited under the pretext of returning a purchase, and his eyes had lingered greedily on the hall's mirrors. Even Lady Margaret, for all her poise, seemed to know more than she was telling. Inspector Hollis decided to search Sir Alister's study, but found nothing except a locked drawer containing letters. Most were dull business correspondence, But one was different. It was dated only a week ago, unsigned, and read, "You cannot keep them forever. The truth will come through the glass." That night, as the guests retired under the watch of an increasingly jumpy staff, Miss Marple sat in her room, thinking. She had not yet solved the locked room puzzle, but she knew one thing. The key to it was not the door, but the mirror. The smear at its center suggested recent contact. Perhaps someone had adjusted it. And if the angle was subtly wrong, perhaps it was not an ordinary mirror at all. But how could a mirror kill a man, lock a door, and leave no trace? The question hung in her mind, unsettling as the distorted reflection of her own face staring back at her from the dressing table. And somewhere in the hall, she was certain someone else was awake, watching her. The wind pressed against the long windows of Graythorne Hall that night, making the glass tremble with each gust. Most of the guests had retired, though it was clear sleep would not come easily. Doors were bolted, fires stoked higher than usual, and footsteps in the halls seemed quieter, more deliberate, as though everyone feared the house itself might be listening. Miss Marple, however, did not take to her room. Instead, she lingered in the library, a cavernous space lined with dark oak shelves and smelling faintly of old paper and lavender polish. Inspector Hollis was there too, hunched over a small writing desk with his notes spread before him. He was drawing lines between names and times, lips pressed tight, the picture of professional determination. But while Hollis kept his focus on the statements given, Miss Marple's eyes roamed. The library was furnished in the same peculiar fashion as the rest of the hall, oil portraits, heavy drapery, and of course mirrors. One in particular caught her attention, a narrow gilt-framed piece above the mantel. Unlike the others, its surface had a faint ripple, so subtle it would be missed unless you looked directly into it. When she stepped closer, the reflection of the fire seemed to waver unnaturally, almost as though it belonged to another room entirely. Hollis noticed her gaze. "Don't tell me you're going to start with the mirrors too," he said with a half-smile. "The man liked his glasswork. Eccentric taste, that's all." Miss Marple made a small agreeable sound but did not turn away. "I wonder," she murmured, "if taste is all it is. People who surround themselves with one thing often have a reason, sentimental, practical, or otherwise." Her attention was drawn away by a soft creak at the doorway. Henry Graythorne, the heir, stood there. His face was pale, his voice sharper than intended. "Inspector, I've remembered something," he said. "When I passed the Blue Chamber this morning, I thought I heard my uncle speaking. But the odd thing was his voice sounded different, muffled, almost as if he were in a closed cupboard. I didn't knock. He hated being interrupted." Miss Marple watched the young man closely. His eyes flickered toward her for only a moment, but it was enough. There was a guardedness there, a calculation. When he left, she turned to Hollis. "Do you see? It is not what he said, but how he said it. Why give that detail now when earlier he claimed not to have been near the Blue Chamber all day?" Hollis shrugged, jotting a note. "People forget things, or they remember what seems important later." "Oh," Miss Marple said softly, "they adjust their memory to suit the circumstances." Later that morning, under Hollis's grudging consent, she returned to the Blue Chamber. The police had finished their examination, leaving the room in a careful disarray. The mirror still stood where it had, the faint smear unchanged. She crossed the carpet, measuring each step as though the distance itself might reveal something. When she stood before the mirror, she leaned close, studying not herself but the frame. A thin seam ran along the right edge, barely visible. She pressed it, and the frame shifted slightly, not much, but enough to show it was not fixed entirely to the wall. Behind it, she thought she caught the faintest breath of cooler air. Hollis appeared in the doorway. "Find something?" "Perhaps," she said without turning. "But it will keep. The dead do not hurry, Inspector." Before he could reply, there was a sudden commotion in the hall. Elsie, the young housemaid, stood there with her hands to her mouth. "It's gone," she cried. "One of the mirrors in the green salon vanished in the night." They followed her down to the green salon, where indeed there was a pale square of wall where a mirror had been. The hooks were still in place, as though it had been lifted down carefully rather than wrenched away. Hollis swore under his breath. "Who would take it?" he demanded. Miss Marple's eyes rested briefly on Monsieur Leclerc, who had arrived late to breakfast and now lingered in the doorway, pretending to look shocked. His expression was almost convincing, but only almost. She noted how he avoided looking directly at the empty space on the wall, as though it might reveal something to him that he didn't wish to betray. The police questioned everyone, but no one admitted to hearing movement in the night. It seemed impossible for such a large object to vanish without notice. Yet as Miss Marple looked around the salon, she saw the answer, not in the space where the mirror had hung, but in the opposite wall, where another mirror remained. In its reflection, the pale square looked as though it were in a slightly different place than it truly was. She said nothing, filing the observation away. By the time the guests gathered for luncheon, the tension in the air had thickened. Conversations stopped abruptly when others approached. Eyes darted more than they met, and the clink of cutlery seemed too loud in the heavy silence. Miss Marple sat quietly at the far end of the table, noting the patterns, who glanced at whom, who avoided whose gaze. She saw Lady Margaret watching Henry with an expression that was not quite maternal concern, and Monsieur Leclerc smiling too much at nothing in particular. The first sign of open deception came as the plates were cleared. Hollis, still frustrated by the missing mirror, asked Leclerc directly if he had any interest in Sir Alister's collection. Leclerc waved the question off with theatrical indignation, too theatrical, and then he made a small mistake. "Even if I did," he said, "it would be impossible to move such a thing without a sound." No one had yet mentioned that the disappearance had been silent. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked quietly in her lap. She did not look at him, but her mind sharpened around that slip, knowing that sooner or later she would catch him making another. But there was still the matter of Sir Alister's death, the locked door, the smear on the mirror, the whispering in the blue chamber, and now a vanished mirror, taken in the night, as though someone feared it might betray them. Whatever the truth was, it was beginning to gleam through the glass, and Miss Marple meant to see it clearly. The afternoon light in Graythorne Hall was a pale, reluctant thing, filtering through tall windows as though it feared to disturb the shadows within. Inspector Hollis had decided it was time to conduct formal questioning in the library, and one by one, the guests were summoned to face his steady, if somewhat impatient, inquiries. Miss Marple sat unobtrusively near the hearth, her knitting needles clicking softly. She had no official role, but no one seemed to mind her presence, at least not openly. In her experience, people grew careless when they thought they were being polite. Henry Graythorne was called first. He lounged in the high-backed chair opposite Hollis, looking every inch the reluctant heir. "I told you," he said. "I was in the billiard room when it happened. Ask anyone. We were playing until nearly midnight, and before that—" Hollis pressed. Henry's eyes slid toward Miss Marple, then away. "I was in my room reading." Miss Marple's needles paused, though she did not lift her head. "Forgive me," she said mildly, "but I believe you mentioned last night that you were in the garden before dinner. You did not say anything about going upstairs until later." Henry's lips tightened. "Yes, well, one forgets the order of things. I stepped into my room briefly to fetch a jacket. That's all." It was not much, but it was the second time his account had shifted, and Miss Marple stored it away like a bead on a string. Next came Lady Margaret. She sat prim and composed, gloved hands resting neatly in her lap. Her voice was calm, but her eyes, restless, watchful, betrayed her. "Sir Alister was a man of strong opinions," she said. "That evening he was troubled. Distracted, I suppose, but I thought it best not to press him." Hollis asked if she had seen him after dinner. "No," she said smoothly. "I retired early. My head ached." Miss Marple glanced up at that. "Curious," she murmured, "for I happened to see you in the west corridor shortly before the alarm was raised. I recall it because you were walking quite quickly." Lady Margaret's composure wavered for the barest moment before she smiled. "I had forgotten. I was looking for a maid to bring me some water. But the blue chamber, I had no reason to be near it." It was an odd answer, Miss Marple thought. A woman of Lady Margaret's self-possession did not forget such a thing unless she wished to. Monsieur Leclerc entered next, all continental charm and wounded dignity. He protested at length about his innocence, sprinkling his speech with elegant shrugs and mournful sighs. "I came to return a small item to Sir Alister," he explained. "A trifle, a misunderstanding from years ago. I had no quarrel with the man." Hollis leaned forward. "And where is this item now?" Leclerc hesitated. "Ah, it is no longer in my possession. Sir Alistair insisted on keeping it when I arrived." Miss Marple's voice drifted into the pause. "And was this item perhaps a mirror?" He gave a quick, startled look before smiling again. "No, madam. A picture frame, bronze. The mirror collection is his. How do you say obsession?" It was a neat answer, but too neat. Miss Marple noticed how his hands, well manicured, perfectly steady, tightened imperceptibly when he said the word mirror. The questioning moved to Elsie, the young maid. She stood nervously, twisting her apron. "I don't know anything, sir," she said, glancing between Hollis and Miss Marple. "I heard the scream and ran to tell Mr. Crawford, that's the butler, and then I stayed downstairs." "You saw Sir Alistair earlier in the day," Miss Marple reminded her gently. "At the blue chamber mirror." "Yes, ma'am," Elsie swallowed. "He looked frightened. Not angry, frightened. Like he'd seen something that wasn't there. I told him as much, and he told me to mind my work." "Did anyone else go into the blue chamber before dinner?" Elsie hesitated. I think Lady Margaret went in, just for a moment, but she looked pale when she came out." That made 3 different accounts of Lady Margaret's movements, each less consistent than the last. The butler, Mr. Crawford, was next. His manner was as stiff as the starch in his collar. "I have served this household 30 years, he said. "I was in the servants' hall when the alarm was raised. The door to the blue chamber was locked when I reached it. I had to force it open with my shoulder." Miss Marple tilted her head. "You said last night that you used a master key." "Yes, madam, but in the confusion—" He stopped abruptly, then inclined his head. "I misspoke. The key was in the lock inside the room. I could not open it from the outside." The correction was too quick, too eager. In her mind, Miss Marple noted it alongside the others. By the time Hollis dismissed the last witness, the air in the library felt thick with half-truths. Everyone had spoken. No one had told the same story twice. And while some, like Leclerc, tried too hard to appear unbothered, others, Henry, Lady Margaret, had given just enough to suggest they were holding something back. When they were alone, Hollis rubbed his temples. "Half of them are lying, but I'll be damned if I can prove which half." Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their quiet clicking. "Oh, they're all telling the truth," she said lightly. "Just not the same one. That's the trouble with lies, Inspector. They tend to multiply. We shall have to see which of their truths survives the glass." Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows as if in agreement. Somewhere deeper in the house, a floorboard creaked, slow, deliberate, like a step taken by someone who didn't wish to be heard. Miss Marple did not look up, but she was listening now with the keenest attention. The game, she knew, was no longer about who had the motive. It was about who understood the mirrors and feared what they might reveal. The storm that had been brewing all day finally broke that evening, rain striking the long windows of Graythorne Hall in sharp bursts, wind winding itself through the chimneys with a low, restless moan. The sound seemed to suit the mood of the house, uneasy, expectant, as if the walls themselves knew that the polite civility of its guests was wearing thin. Miss Marple had taken her seat in the small morning room off the main hall, a space that allowed her an excellent vantage point to observe comings and goings without being noticed herself. A pot of tea sat cooling on the side table, untouched. Her attention was not on refreshment, but on the threads of motive that had begun to form in her mind, threads that crossed, tangled, and knotted into something far more complex than a simple crime of passion or greed. Henry Graythorne was the most obvious beneficiary of Sir Alistair's death. The inheritance was considerable, the hall, the lands, and whatever peculiar fortune the old man had tucked away from his long career in shipping. And yet, Henry was already deep in debt, his gambling losses whispered about by more than one guest. A windfall might have seemed his salvation, but killing one's uncle in a locked room was hardly the straightforward route to solvency. Unless, of course, Henry knew a way to make it appear an accident. Lady Margaret's position was more delicate. She was not a blood relative, but had been Sir Alistair's companion for the better part of a decade, and while the arrangement was discreet, it had kept her in comfort and society. If Sir Alistair had intended to marry her, her future was secure. If not, and if he had recently changed his will, her place in the world might soon be far less certain. Miss Marple recalled the look that passed between Lady Margaret and Henry at luncheon, a look that was not quite hostile, but far from warm. They were not allies, at least not yet. Monsieur Leclerc's motives were buried beneath layers of charm, but Miss Marple had seen through the first layer already. His sudden appearance with a vague story about returning a small item had been too convenient. If Sir Alister's mirror collection was as valuable and as peculiar as she suspected, then Leclerc's interest was professional. Art dealers were rarely sentimental, and even less so when there was profit to be had. The missing mirror from the green salon could easily be tied to him, though proving it would be another matter. The servants were not above suspicion either. Mr. Crawford, the butler, had been in Sir Alister's service for decades, but loyalty could sour with time. Miss Marple had noted his quick correction when questioned about the door. Too quick, as though rehearsed. And Elsie, the maid, while guileless in manner, had been in precisely the right corridor at precisely the right time earlier that day. Innocent coincidence or careful positioning? Fear threaded through all their accounts. Fear of poverty, of exposure, of losing something that could not be regained. And yet none of these motives explained the locked door, the whispering into the blue chamber mirror, or the fact that one of the mirrors had vanished without a sound in the night. Miss Marple poured herself a fresh cup of tea and began arranging the facts as she would a patchwork quilt. Each square a piece of truth, no matter how small, until the larger picture began to emerge. Sir Alister had been afraid, that much was certain. Elsie had seen it, and Miss Marple herself had caught the tension in his manner at dinner. He had excused himself to check something upstairs, and locked himself in the blue chamber. The smear on the mirror suggested he had touched it deliberately, perhaps to adjust it or open it. If the seam she had felt was indeed a concealed hinge, then behind it might be, well, what? A hiding place? A passage? Or something even stranger? The missing mirror troubled her most. Why remove it unless it too concealed something? If Leclerc had taken it, then perhaps the collection was more than decorative. It was functional. A set of looking glasses positioned to see things no one else could. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door opening. Henry stepped in, clearly surprised to find her there. "Miss Marple," he said cautiously, "the inspector's looking for you." "Is he indeed?" She set down her cup. "And what about you, Mr. Graythorne? Looking for something yourself?" He gave a tight smile. "Only some peace and quiet. This house is becoming unbearable." "Such situations often are," she said mildly, "especially when everyone has so much to lose." His expression hardened. "If you're implying—" "I imply nothing, Mr. Graythorne, I observe. And I have observed that your uncle's death solves a number of your problems, though it creates one or two as well." For a moment, she thought he might say something sharp, but instead he laughed without humor. "You think you've got it all worked out? Well, good luck. My uncle made enemies in more ways than one. You might be surprised who hated him most." When he left, she sat for a moment longer, considering that. Who indeed? A man like Sir Alister, secretive and controlling, might have left a trail of resentment behind him, like crumbs for a careful mind to follow. By the time she joined Hollis in the study, the inspector was frowning over a map of the hall. "Look here," he said, tapping a spot in the west wing. "The blue chamber shares a wall with the old gallery. No door between them, but there's space. Could be a sealed passage, or a hidden one," Miss Marple said, her voice thoughtful. "One that might explain how a murderer entered and left without touching the lock or window." Hollis's eyes narrowed. "If that's true, it means this wasn't spur of the moment. Someone planned it, knew the layout, maybe even knew about the passage," which brought her thoughts back to the suspects. Henry would have known the house from childhood. Lady Margaret had free run of it for years. Crawford knew every corridor, every cupboard. And Leclerc, if his interest in the mirrors was more than monetary, might have studied the hall's eccentricities long before he arrived. As she stood beside the map, the web in her mind tightened. Every thread led back to the mirrors, and to whatever truth they concealed. The challenge would be to untangle the human motives from the physical trick, and to do so before the rain outside washed away more than just the day's light. For in the shifting reflections of Graythorne Hall, truth was a fragile thing, and she suspected someone was already trying to break it. The rain had not stopped by the next morning, but the mood inside Graythorne Hall was brighter, at least for Inspector Hollis. At 9:30, a constable arrived from the village, dripping water on the tiled floor. carrying a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Inside was the missing mirror from the green salon. It had been found half buried in a hedgerow along the North Drive, its gilt frame scuffed and its glass spiderwebbed with cracks. Caught red-handed by the countryside, Hollis said with satisfaction as the mirror was unwrapped on the library table. And the best part, the groundskeeper saw who left it there. Monsieur Leclerc came out under cover of darkness, lugging the thing like a thief in a penny novel. Leclerc was brought in within the hour, looking damp and indignant. "This is outrageous," he declared, shaking water from his cuffs. "I did not steal it. I was returning it to its rightful place." "You returned it," Hollis said dryly, "by abandoning it in a hedge." Leclerc flung up his hands. "Sir Alistair lent it to me years ago. It is part of a set, rare and valuable. I brought it back, yes, but when he refused to acknowledge the loan, I feared it might implicate me in his unfortunate death. I meant to hide it until things were settled. That is all." The inspector didn't bother to hide his smirk. "You admit to taking it from the salon after his death, then?" "Yes, but not to killing him." To Hollis it was a confession of sorts. Theft after the fact was still a crime, and more importantly, it tied Leclerc directly to the oddities surrounding the mirrors. By luncheon, the inspector had made his announcement to the household. The mirror had been part of a smuggling operation. Leclerc had tried to reclaim it to protect himself, and Sir Alistair had caught him in the act. A struggle had ensued in the blue chamber, ending in the fatal fall. It was a neat theory. Too neat. Miss Marple, sitting with her knitting in the corner, allowed the room its moment of relief before speaking. "It is certainly a plausible explanation, Inspector," she said mildly, "but perhaps a trifle hasty." Hollis frowned. "We've got the missing object, a witness placing him at the scene, and his own admission that he removed it. What more do you need?" "Only," Miss Marple said, "that none of this explains how Monsieur Leclerc got into a room locked from the inside, nor why Sir Alistair would have been whispering to his own reflection shortly before his death." Her words landed like a faint draught in the room, enough to make people glance uneasily at one another. Still, the inspector was unmoved. "We'll let the magistrate worry about those details. For now, the man's in custody. Case closed, case closed." The words sat ill with her. They had the wrong shape, like a garment hurriedly fastened over the wrong form. She could feel the true outline beneath. That night the hall settled into an uneasy quiet. Rain pattered steadily at the windows, and the fire in the drawing-room burned low. Most of the guests had retired early, relieved or pretending to be that the ordeal was over. Miss Marple, however, found herself drawn once more to the blue chamber. She carried no candle. The moonlight through the high windows was enough. The mirror on the far wall caught it in cold slivers, and the faint smear at its center seemed to gleam faintly, as if inviting her closer. She touched the seam again. It gave beneath her fingers the same subtle shift as before, and this time she pressed more firmly. The frame swung out an inch, then two, revealing a narrow space behind, no more than a cavity but deep enough to conceal something. She bent close and saw the glint of a polished surface within, angled oddly, reflecting not the blue chamber, but a section of the west corridor outside its door. A trick of positioning. This was no ordinary mirror. It was a watching glass. A sudden creak behind her made her turn. Henry Graythorne stood in the doorway, pale in the moonlight. "Couldn't sleep," he said, his tone too casual. "You're a late wanderer yourself, Miss Marple." "Sometimes," she replied, "especially when the story one is told does not quite fit the facts." He smiled faintly, but his eyes were fixed on the open edge of the mirror. "Perhaps you think I had something to do with it." "I think," she said, "that many people here had reason to wish your uncle harm, but motive alone does not open a locked door." For a moment something flickered in his expression, quickly hidden but not quickly enough. He stepped back into the hall with a polite bow. "Good night, Miss Marple." She waited until his footsteps faded before closing the mirror and slipping back to her room. The inspector's tidy solution had bought them a fragile peace, but it would not last. The real killer was still here, watching, and now they knew she was looking in the right direction. Miss Marple had seen it before, cases where the wrong arrest lulled the guilty into thinking the danger had passed. That was when they grew bold, and boldness, in her experience, was when they made mistakes. She would be ready when that moment came. Late into the damp, restless night, Miss Marple found herself unable to settle. Though the household had been reassured by Inspector Hollis's swift arrest of Monsieur Leclerc, the old woman's instincts whispered otherwise. Something in the tangled threads of the case refused to lie still. As she sat by the fading fire in the library, her eyes drifted over the familiar rows of books and faded leather spines, seeking a distraction. Her gaze settled on a volume she had noticed earlier in the day, a leather-bound collection of local history and court records tucked away on a high shelf. Something compelled her to reach for it, and with careful fingers she pulled the heavy tome down. The pages crackled softly as she leafed through them, settling finally on a report from nearly 20 years ago. It was a scandal that had barely made the papers beyond the county, the mysterious death of a man named Julian Eversfield, brother to Lady Margaret. The verdict had been accidental, but the circumstances were shadowy. A fall from a grand staircase in a house not unlike Graythorne Hall, in a room filled with mirrors. Miss Marple's fingers traced the faded text. Julian had been found at the foot of the staircase, a broken neck, eerily similar to Sir Alister's death. No suspects had ever been named, and the case had gone cold. She recalled the tension she had seen between Lady Margaret and Henry Graythorne, but what had escaped her attention was Lady Margaret's last name, Eversfield. Could there be more to her than a quiet companion to the aging Sir Alister? The morning light crept through the curtains as she quietly sought out Lady Margaret. The woman was in the conservatory, tending to ferns with an expression far too still, like a statue caught in time. "Lady Margaret," Miss Marple began gently, "I was reading about your family history, and I came across a troubling event. The death of your brother, Julian. It was said to be accidental, but many accidents have stories behind them, do they not?" Lady Margaret's eyes flickered, a shadow crossing her face. "That was a long time ago," she said softly. "Julian was reckless, and the house was full of mirrors then too. He was obsessed with his own reflection, much like my late uncle." She hesitated. "Not many knew, but Julian's death cast a long shadow on our family." "Did you ever suspect foul play?" Miss Marple asked. "No," Lady Margaret said quickly, but the edge in her voice was unmistakable. "Not at the time," Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Sometimes the truth hides behind reflections we are too frightened to face." Later that day, Miss Marple summoned Henry Graythorne and Lady Margaret to the library. "I believe the deaths of Sir Alister and Julian Eversfield are linked," she said. "More than coincidence, they share a pattern. Mirrors, broken necks, locked rooms." Henry shifted uneasily. "What are you implying?" he asked. "That someone may have been waiting a long time to settle an old score," Miss Marple replied. "And that the mirrors are more than just decorative. They are a key to that past." As they spoke, the web of family secrets and old grudges began to unravel. Lady Margaret's quiet presence at Graythorne Hall was no accident. Her connection to the Eversfield tragedy tied her inexorably to the current mystery. Henry's resentment toward both her and his uncle hinted at a tangled history, one where alliances were brittle and motives tangled. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the mirrors, their odd angles, the hidden hinges, and the watching glasses that might conceal a truth more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The crime was not merely a product of greed or jealousy, but a shadow cast across decades, a family haunted by its own reflection. And in the glimmering glass of Graythorne Hall, the past was waiting patiently to reveal its final secret. The house had settled into an uneasy silence as dusk deepened into night, the rain finally tapering off outside Graythorne Hall. Miss Marple moved quietly through the dim corridors, her steps light but purposeful. The flicker of candlelight cast wavering shadows across the polished wood, and every mirror along the way seemed to catch the glow, reflecting fragments of the house's long-held secrets. She was not alone. Though the household believed the mystery solved with Monsieur Leclerc's arrest, Miss Marple had long since learned that appearances were often deceiving. Now she planned a subtle test, one that might unsettle the true culprit and pry open the door to the truth. In the drawing room, the guests had gathered again, lingering over cups of tea and nervous conversation. Lady Margaret sat poised by the fire, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Henry paced near the window, his gaze fixed on the distant trees. Monsieur Leclerc remained withdrawn, the recent ordeal having visibly shaken him. Miss Marple cleared her throat softly and addressed the room. "I thought it might be enlightening to conduct a small experiment." She produced a delicate hand mirror, framed in intricate silver filigree, its surface gleaming under the chandelier. I'd like each of you, in turn, to look into this mirror and speak aloud a memory involving Sir Alistair. Anything that strikes you as unusual or troubling. Sometimes the way we recall things reveals as much as what we say. The request was met with polite curiosity. Lady Margaret was the first to accept, lifting the mirror and peering into it as if searching not only her reflection, but her thoughts. "He was a complicated man," she began, voice steady. "Obsessed with control. Over the house over us." Her eyes darkened. "I remember once, years ago, he caught Julian Eversfield sneaking into the West Wing." They argued bitterly. Julian was defiant, but Sir Alistair's anger was like a storm. It frightened me. Henry was next. His reflection seemed troubled as he took the mirror, but his words were clipped. He was strict, sure, hard to please, but I always thought the real danger came from outside the family, business rivals, creditors. His fingers clenched the mirror's edge. Still, the night he died, something felt off, like he knew someone was watching. Monsieur Leclerc accepted the mirror reluctantly, his dark eyes flickering nervously. When he spoke, his voice was low. "Sir Alistair and I had an arrangement. He trusted me with certain valuables, but there were things even he would not show me. I feared what might be hidden behind those mirrors. Finally, Miss Marple handed the mirror to the butler, Mr. Crawford. He stared at it for a long moment, before speaking in a measured tone. I have served this house faithfully. Yet, I have witnessed secrets that would chill any man's soul." Sir Alistair's fear was not for himself, but for something buried in the past, a debt unpaid, a betrayal never confessed. As the last words settled, the room was heavy with unspoken tension. Miss Marple's gaze swept across the faces, some pale, some guarded. Then suddenly Henry's hand trembled and the mirror slipped, clattering onto the floor. A sharp crack spiderwebbed across the glass. The room froze. Henry's eyes met Miss Marple's, a flicker of panic there before he composed himself. "It was an accident," he said quickly, voice tight, but Miss Marple saw the fracture not just in the mirror, but in his demeanor. "Mirrors can lie," she said softly, "but they also reflect the truth in the most unexpected ways." That night, alone in her room, Miss Marple pondered the cracked mirror, the flicker of fear she had seen. The game was far from over, and the next move belonged to her. The morning sun was weak behind a veil of heavy clouds as Miss Marple entered the library, a room she had come to regard almost as a second home during the unfolding mystery. But today an unsettling chill crept up her spine before she even crossed the threshold. The massive oak table, usually cluttered with scattered papers and notepads, lay suspiciously bare. The leather-bound ledger, a tome that Sir Alistair had kept hidden away, and which Miss Marple had hoped might contain a clue, was nowhere to be found. Her heart quickened. The ledger was not just any record. It was rumoured to document Sir Alistair's dealings, potentially exposing secrets someone desperately wanted to remain buried. "Inspector Hollis," she called softly, her voice steady despite the unease tightening her chest. He appeared in the doorway moments later, his usual composed expression replaced by grim concern. "The ledger's gone," she said without preamble. Hollis nodded. "We found the lock on the side cabinet forced open. Whoever took it knew exactly what they were after." Miss Marple's mind raced. The ledger's disappearance meant more than a theft. It was an attempt to derail the investigation, to erase the fragile threads she had painstakingly woven together. "Did anyone hear or see anything unusual last night?" she asked. "Nothing," Hollis replied, his voice edged with frustration. "Everyone's on edge. Trust is running thin, but this is bold." As the household gathered later, suspicion hung thick in the air like fog. Eyes darted nervously, and whispered conversations faltered the moment they were noticed. The missing ledger had become a catalyst, inflaming fears and laying bare the cracks in relationships. Lady Margaret was the first to speak, her tone icy. "If someone among us is sabotaging the search for truth, they will regret it. The past cannot be buried forever." Henry Greythorne's jaw tightened, and he shot a sharp glance at Monsieur Leclerc, who remained composed. Though a flicker of unease crossed his features, Miss Marple observed them all, weighing their reactions carefully. The vanishing ledger was not just a lost artifact. It was a message someone was watching, waiting, and willing to strike to keep their secrets hidden. Determined not to let the trail go cold, Miss Marple revisited the blue chamber, examining the mirrors with renewed scrutiny. The watching glass she had discovered earlier now seemed less a curiosity and more a tool in a sinister game. Her fingers traced the edges of the secret cavity, and then, almost imperceptibly, she found a thin thread of dust disturbed, recently brushed aside. Someone had used the hidden space to conceal or retrieve something. The realization deepened her resolve. The thief was clever, perhaps even daring, but not infallible. Later, she discreetly placed a small, almost invisible mark on the back of one of the surviving mirrors in the green salon. A secret tally only she knew to check. Trust was fragile, but Miss Marple was patient. The shadows that cloaked Graythorn Hall were beginning to thin, and soon the truth would emerge, no matter who tried to silence it. The candlelight flickered violently as a sudden gust swept through the long corridor outside Miss Marple's chamber. Though the windows were tightly shut, a chill seemed to seep into the very walls of Graythorn Hall, as if the house itself were warning her of what was to come. She was seated at her writing desk, carefully reviewing the notes she had gathered, the vanished ledger, the cracked mirrors, the web of half-truths and hidden motives. The late hour, the solitude, the silence, all had conspired to lull the household into a fragile calm. But calm was a dangerous thing in a house where shadows danced just beyond the light. A sharp rap at the door startled her. It was Henry Graythorn, breathless, his face pale and drawn. "Miss Marple, there's been an incident." She followed him swiftly down the narrow stairs and through the dim halls until they reached the servants' wing. The household had been roused by a cry, piercing, urgent, that shattered the uneasy peace. In the butler's quarters, they found Mr. Crawford sprawled on the floor, his face twisted in pain. His left arm was bent at an unnatural angle, blood seeping from a shallow gash on his temple. "Who did this?" Miss Marple asked, kneeling beside him, steadying his head. I don't know," he gasped. "Was coming to the library. Heard footsteps behind me. Then, nothing. The attack was swift and silent. Whoever had struck Crawford knew their way around the house and wanted to send a message. Someone's trying to stop us," Miss Marple said grimly. "They fear what we might uncover." The household was shaken. Walls once cloaked in whispered secrets now seemed to close in. Eyes darted with suspicion, and the once polite veneer of civility fractured. Inspector Hollis, arriving minutes later, ordered the house to be sealed. No one could leave, no one could enter without his knowledge. Miss Marple knew the game had changed. This was no longer merely a question of uncovering past wrongs. Now they were fighting to prevent further bloodshed. She studied the faces gathered in the drawing room that evening. Lady Margaret's composure was strained, Henry's restless energy palpable, and even Leclerc's charm seemed forced, his eyes flickering nervously under the low light. "Someone among us is desperate," she said softly, "and desperate people make mistakes." As she spoke, a faint sound came from the corridor, a deliberate tap, 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 like a code or a warning. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The mirrors were still watching, and the villain was still several steps ahead, and the villain was still several steps ahead. The storm outside had subsided into a gentle drizzle by the time Miss Marple retreated to the drawing room, where a low fire crackled and sent flickering shadows across the walls. The household had been reduced to a tense quiet. Every glance, every breath felt weighted with suspicion and fear. She settled into her favorite armchair, knitting forgotten on her lap, and let her gaze wander over the faces of those gathered. Lady Margaret sat composed but pale, fingers tightly entwined. Henry Graythorn fidgeted with a silver cigarette case, his eyes darting restlessly. Monsieur Leclerc appeared calm, but a faint crease between his brows betrayed his unease. Miss Marple's mind sifted through the puzzle pieces, the missing ledger, the broken mirrors, the secret passage behind the blue chamber's glass. But amid the labyrinth of deceit it was a tiny, overlooked detail that began to surface in her thoughts, a detail no one else had noticed. During one of the earlier questionings, Elsie the maid had mentioned something peculiar about Sir Alistair's habits. He had an unusual routine. Every evening he would pause before a certain mirror in the green salon, whisper something softly, then adjust its frame ever so slightly. The words were never heard clearly, but the gesture was consistent. Miss Marple recalled that when she first examined the mirrors, one of them had a slight looseness in its frame, just enough for someone familiar to shift it without notice. The implication was clear. The mirrors were not mere decorations, but part of a concealed mechanism. She rose and walked slowly to the green salon, her footsteps soft on the thick carpet. The mirror in question stood against the wall, reflecting the dim light of the room. She examined the frame carefully, feeling along its edges until her fingers found a barely perceptible catch. With a gentle push, the mirror swung open, revealing a narrow recess behind it. Inside lay a small leather-bound notebook, its pages yellowed with age. Returning to the drawing room, she held the notebook for all to see. "This belonged to Sir Alistair," she announced. "It contains his personal observations, thoughts, and a record of those he distrusted most." As she flipped through the pages, the room fell silent. Names were listed, accompanied by brief notes, some cryptic, others chillingly clear. One entry caught her eye. Henry Graythorne, reckless, desperate. Lady Margaret Eversfield, unsettled past. Monsieur Leclerc, interested in more than art. But what truly made her pause was the final note, scrawled hastily at the end of the ledger. "Beware the mirror that lies, the truth hides in reflections broken." A sudden movement caught her attention. Henry's fingers clenched the armrest, knuckles white. Lady Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. Leclerc's calm veneer slipped momentarily, revealing a flicker of fear. Miss Marple met their eyes steadily. "The pattern was here all along," she said quietly. "A network of secrets, masked by appearances and fractured reflections. The key was never a missing piece. It was how the pieces were arranged." She set the notebook down. "And now, with this knowledge, we must uncover who wields the mirrors to manipulate truth and to kill." Outside, the rain finally ceased, leaving the world washed and waiting. Inside Graythorne Hall, the real reckoning had only just begun. The air in the drawing room had thickened into something almost tangible, like a fog pressing in on the gathered company. Miss Marple stood quietly by the mantelpiece, her eyes calm but resolute as they swept the faces before her. Each person was a thread in a tapestry, woven with secrets, lies, and half-truths. But one thread was pulled taut enough to unravel the whole. She began gently. "The ledger and the mirrors have shown us many things. But the heart of this mystery lies not in what was taken or hidden, but in what was feared, the past, and the shadows it casts upon us." Henry Graythorne shifted uneasily, but it was Lady Margaret who spoke first, voice low and steady. "You've said much, Miss Marple, but what is it you truly believe?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That the crime committed here was born not from greed or petty revenge, but from a far deeper wound, one that scarred the soul." She moved to the window, where the last light of dusk painted the sky in bruised purples and gold. Sir Alistair was a man consumed by his need for control, not just of his estate, but of his family's legacy. But there was something else he feared more, the truth about his bloodline. A sharp intake of breath came from Lady Margaret, her composure flickering. "You mean—" "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "Julian Eversfield's death was no accident. It was covered up to protect a secret that, if revealed, would have destroyed reputations and perhaps lives." She turned back to Henry, whose expression was guarded but trembling. "You and Lady Margaret share more than just a household. Your families are bound by history, old grievances and secrets that were never meant to see the light." Henry's jaw tightened. "We all have skeletons. What does that prove? That someone in this house was desperate enough to kill to keep those skeletons hidden." Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Monsieur Leclerc. "And you, monsieur, played a part in this dance, whether knowingly or as a pawn, because the mirrors were never just art. They were a means of surveillance, control and fear." Leclerc's eyes flickered with something like regret. "I only wished to protect my interests. The rest was beyond me." Miss Marple stepped forward, voice growing firmer. "The murderer sought to bury the past so deeply that no reflection, no matter how broken, could reveal it. But the truth has a way of finding light." There was a long silence before Lady Margaret spoke again, voice barely above a whisper. "It was me," the room gasped. "I could no longer live in the shadow of what was done to my brother, to my family. Sir Alistair's death was the final act in a long play of deception and fear." Her eyes glistened with tears. "I never meant for anyone else to suffer. But when I saw what was coming, How far the web would reach, I acted. Miss Marple nodded gently. And in doing so, you believed you were protecting us all. Lady Margaret's shoulders sagged as the weight of confession settled over her. The crime was no longer just about inheritance or power. It was about fear, the fear that a family's dark past would come to light and consume them all. As the household absorbed the revelation, Miss Marple knew the hardest part was over. The truth was out, raw and painful, but in that rawness lay the first steps toward healing and justice. The evening sun dipped low behind the trees surrounding Greythorn Hall, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the manicured lawns. Inside the great house, the atmosphere was taut, every breath held, every eye wary. The storm of suspicion, secrets, and half-truths was about to break, and Miss Marple had arranged the final act with meticulous care. She stood calmly in the drawing-room, the very heart of the house, where the mirrors, silent witnesses to so much, caught the fading light and scattered it in fractured patterns across the walls. The assembled company filled the room, their faces a mixture of dread and defiance. Lady Margaret sat quietly, pale but resolute. Henry Greythorn paced near the window, his fingers twitching anxiously. Monsieur Leclerc leaned against the bookcase, his usually composed demeanor strained. Miss Marple's gaze rested briefly on each of them before she spoke, her voice steady and clear. Tonight the truth will come to light, not through shadows, not through whispers, but through the evidence that binds us all. She gestured toward the large mirror in the green salon, now reopened to reveal its secret recess. Sir Alistair's ledger was hidden here, and it contains the key to understanding the motives that have driven this house to tragedy. The door to the drawing-room was suddenly closed and locked by the butler who had been watching from the wings. The act was quiet but deliberate, the final seal on a stage set for revelation. Miss Marple turned back to the group, eyes gleaming with quiet triumph. The mirrors were never just mirrors. They were instruments of control, surveillance, and ultimately fear. Her voice softened as she faced Lady Margaret. You believed you were protecting your family's legacy, but in doing so you sowed chaos and death. Lady Margaret's face was a mask of sorrow as she stood, her hands trembling slightly. Yes, she confessed. I killed Sir Alistair. It was the only way to silence the past before it destroyed us all. A collective gasp rippled through the room, but Miss Marple raised a hand for silence. But how could you be certain no one else would discover your secret? The missing mirror, the secret passage, these were your means of concealment. Lady Margaret hesitated, then lowered her gaze. I did not act alone. I thought I was controlling everything, but I underestimated others. The tension thickened as Miss Marple's eyes flicked to Henry. Mr. Greythorn, you have much to answer for as well. Henry's bravado cracked. I only wanted my rightful inheritance. If that made me complicit, so be it. Miss Marple stepped forward, voice firm. Complicity is a dangerous thing, but the ultimate crime was born from fear and desperation. Suddenly a noise came from the corridor, a soft, scuffling sound, almost imperceptible. Everyone turned toward the door just as Monsieur Leclerc pushed it open with a swift motion. In his hand was a small, ornate box, the last missing piece. Leclerc's voice was steady, but edged with desperation. The mirrors were a secret I sought to protect, yes, but I never wished harm. I came to reveal the truth before it was too late. He opened the box, revealing several glass shards, fragments of the broken mirror Henry had shattered days before. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Shards that hold the final clue, the broken reflections that could not lie. As she approached the box, Henry made a sudden move, lunging toward the window in a last desperate attempt to escape. But the butler was quick, stepping forward to block his path. The room held its breath as the tension peaked. Henry's shoulders slumped in defeat. It was all too much, he muttered. The debts, the secrets. I never wanted to kill anyone. Miss Marple smiled gently. The truth is a fragile thing, but it has a way of breaking through the strongest illusions. As the police officers entered to take Henry into custody, Lady Margaret remained seated, her face a study in quiet regret. Miss Marple looked around the room once more, the fractured light of the mirrors reflecting not just shadows, but the hope that clarity might finally come. The case was closed, but the lessons it left behind lingered like the fading echoes of a long-forgotten song. The atmosphere in Greythorn Hall had eased into a tentative calm. Henry Graythorne was securely in custody, Lady Margaret withdrawn into quiet reflection, and Monsieur Leclerc had promised full cooperation with the authorities. Inspector Hollis was drafting his final report, convinced the tangled mystery was resolved at last. Miss Marple, however, felt a restless tug at the edges of her mind, a whisper that the story was not yet finished. That evening, while the others retired, she returned once more to the green salon. The mirrors, which had so often distorted truth and reflection, seemed almost serene now, their surfaces smooth and still in the soft lamplight. Miss Marple moved carefully to the secret panel she had discovered earlier, gently pressing it open to reveal the hollow behind. Inside lay the notebook again, but something else caught her eye. A folded piece of paper, worn and yellowed with age, tucked beneath the leather-bound volume. She unfolded it with care. The document was a letter, penned in a hurried hand but with unmistakable clarity. It spoke of a clandestine alliance between Sir Alistair and a mysterious figure, a confidant whose identity was deliberately obscured. The letter hinted at blackmail, betrayal, and a conspiracy to manipulate the Graythorne legacy for decades. Miss Marple's brow furrowed. This was no ordinary note, it was a confession. A puzzle piece never meant to see the light of day. Her thoughts raced back to the faces she had studied so carefully, the solemn Lady Margaret, the restless Henry, the guarded Leclerc. But there was one who had always seemed a shadow at the edges, Mr. Crawford, the butler, whose loyalty and silence had been unwavering. She crossed the hall to the servants' quarters, where Mr. Crawford was tending the evening fire, his demeanor calm yet watchful. "Mr. Crawford," she began gently, "there is something we must discuss." He looked up, eyes steady but unreadable. "I suspected as much, Miss Marple." Drawing the letter from her pocket, she laid it before him. "This reveals an alliance with Sir Alistair, one no one knew about." His expression tightened. "A burden I have carried longer than you know." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "You protected the family, but at what cost?" He sighed deeply. "The truth was more dangerous than any of us imagined. I feared the fallout would destroy everything. Yet you remained silent, even as lives were lost." "I did what I thought necessary," he replied quietly. Miss Marple studied him a moment longer before nodding slowly. "Then perhaps it is time for that silence to end." Later, in the presence of all the household, Miss Marple revealed the letter and confronted Mr. Crawford with the truth. "I kept the mirrors and their secrets for years," he confessed at last, voice heavy with remorse. "Sir Alistair and I conspired to protect the family name, even as it corroded from within." The room was stunned into silence. "This was never just about inheritance or petty jealousy," Miss Marple said. "It was a long game of power, fear and betrayal, orchestrated by the man you trusted most." Henry looked shattered. Lady Margaret's eyes brimmed with tears, and Leclerc was speechless. Miss Marple concluded softly, "The greatest deception was hidden behind the face of loyalty." The truth had finally surfaced, but it was more complex, more tragic than any had dared imagine. As dawn broke over Graythorne Hall, the fragile peace was tinged with bittersweet clarity. Justice had been served, but the shadows of the past would linger long. Miss Marple, knitting once more by the window, smiled faintly. The mirrors had lied, but in the end the truth was reflected at last. The first light of dawn spilled softly through the stained glass windows of Graythorne Hall, casting fractured colors across the heavy rugs and ornate furniture. Outside, the estate stirred quietly, birds beginning their tentative songs, but inside, the house remained steeped in a silence weighted with truth. Miss Marple stood near the hearth, her hands folded calmly, as Inspector Hollis read aloud the final statements and testimonies. The heavy air seemed to hold its breath as the story of deceit, fear and betrayal was laid bare before them all. The threads of the mystery, mirrors and ledger, shadows and whispered confessions, had been painstakingly unraveled. Justice, it seemed, had been served. Henry Graythorne was to be charged with complicity in the death of Sir Alistair, and Lady Margaret had agreed to cooperate fully, her guilt mingled with sorrow and relief. Monsieur Leclerc's role was reduced to that of a man ensnared by circumstance, and Mr. Crawford had confessed his part in concealing the dark family secrets. Though his own hands bore no blood, yet as the assembly broke up and the household dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze resting once more on the mirrors, their surfaces gleaming quietly in the morning light. She reflected on the path that had brought them here, the cracked glass that revealed hidden compartments, the subtle shifts in demeanor that betrayed hidden truths, the misplaced ledger and the stolen pages that almost obscured the path to justice. But there was one detail, subtle and easily overlooked. That had been the true key to the puzzle. It was the faint scent of lavender, the same scent that had lingered in the blue chamber on the night of Sir Alister's death. A scent none had noticed in their urgency, yet one that Miss Marple had detected amidst the cold, stale air of the room. That scent belonged to none other than Lady Margaret. It was not mere coincidence. It was the silent signature of a guilt carried for years, masked beneath composure and civility. Miss Marple smiled softly, knowing that while justice had been delivered today, the echoes of this tale would ripple through Graythorn Hall for years to come. As she gathered her things to leave, the detective's parting words echoed quietly in the grand hallway. The truth is often hidden in what we choose to overlook, in the reflections we refuse to face. Outside, the sun broke fully free from the clouds, illuminating the path ahead. Yet somewhere in the shadows, a flicker of doubt remained, an unfinished story waiting for another day. Miss Marple stepped out of Graythorn Hall just as the late afternoon sun dipped low behind the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and soft violet. The long shadows stretched across the manicured grounds, where the once tense household now moved with tentative relief, their faces marked by exhaustion and quiet contemplation. The heavy burden of secrets had been lifted, at least for the moment, yet as Miss Marple walked along the gravel path leading away from the great house, her thoughts were far from settled. The case had seemed solved, the culprit unmasked and justice on its way. Still, a small nagging detail lingered in the back of her mind, a subtle dissonance in the symphony of truths she had uncovered. She paused near a cluster of ancient oaks, their gnarled branches swaying softly in the evening breeze. Pulling from her pocket a small scrap of paper she had tucked away, a hastily scribbled note found in the secret compartment behind the green salon mirror, she examined it once more. The words were cryptic, almost poetic. Reflections hide what shadows seek, but not all glass shows what's unique. The phrase had seemed like a simple riddle at first, but now it gnawed at her. What was it that the mirrors hadn't revealed? What secret remained veiled behind the fractured glass and whispered confessions? Her gaze drifted back toward the silhouette of Graythorn Hall, its windows glowing warmly in the twilight. The house had surrendered many of its secrets, but its walls still held stories yet untold, stories that would not be silenced so easily. As she resumed her walk, a figure appeared on the veranda, a tall silhouette watching her departure with inscrutable intent. Miss Marple's keen eyes caught the glint of a silver pendant resting against the stranger's chest, a pendant she had seen once before, in the possession of a visitor who had left abruptly, long before the first shadow of murder darkened the estate. The detective's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. The game was not over. It had merely evolved. A new mystery beckoned, whispered in the rustle of leaves and the lingering scent of lavender carried on the breeze. Miss Marple paused briefly, then continued down the path, her mind already weaving the threads of what was to come, because in the world of shadows and mirrors, the truth never stays still, and neither does she.